everybody, it's Sarah and today I'm here again with this week's Top 5 Wednesday. Top 5 Wednesday was created by Lainey from Ginger Eats Lainey and the host is Sam from Thoughts on Tomes, and I will leave both of their channels as well as the Top 5 Wednesday Goodreads group in the description box down below so you can go and check all of those out. This week's topic is our top 5 gateway books to our favorite genre, and my favorite genre is fantasy, and so I chose especially high fantasy because I feel like it's not that difficult getting into urban fantasy, paranormal fantasy. They are mostly YA books, and I personally just don't feel like it's that difficult to get into YA books. But high fantasy typically has a lot of world building, and the first books in those series, which most of the time are pretty long, can be pretty difficult to get into. And so I chose 5 books that I feel combine the world building and the plot quite well for beginners of the fantasy genre. So let me just get started. First I have The Magician's Guild by Trudy Canavan, which is the first book in the Black Magicians trilogy, I think it's called. And I read this when I was 12, and it's actually an adult high fantasy book, so I really think it's very easy to read. Even though I wasn't exactly a beginner to high fantasy when I was 12, there is not that much world building that I can remember in the first book, but the characters are very likable. There's a lot of political stuff, a lot of society issues that are talked about in this book, and so I think this is perfect for anybody who starts out in fantasy because it's not too fantastical, it's more political. Next I have Brandon Sanderson's standalones, Warbreaker and Elantris, and of course since these are standalones, the world building can't be as elaborate as in a trilogy or a series. I just feel also that Brandon Sanderson's writing style is very accessible, and I'm probably the 500th person talking about the series, but if you're interested in getting a little bit deeper into fantasy but you're still kind of a beginner, I would also really recommend the Mistborn trilogy by him, which is also just fantastical. What I love about Brandon Sanderson is that he has always very unique magic systems, and I have never read a writer who mixes action with political intrigue better than he does. So I would definitely recommend both of those books if you're going to start out with fantasy. Next I have the 2 books that probably got me into high fantasy. They are by different authors, but I kind of put them in the same place, and they are Aragon by Christopher Paolini, the first book in the Inheritance cycle, and Nihil from the Land of the Wind by Licia Truisi, the first book in the Chronicles of the Emerged World. This one is by an Italian author, and I'm not quite sure how the translation is in English. The German one is very well done. What makes this book easier to read is that it's actually a young adult high fantasy book, and what both of those books have in common is that they are very heavy on fantasy tropes. So if you want to start out with something that's very typically high fantasy and where you can kind of see who's good, who's bad, but there's still some twists, I would choose both of those books. I actually don't know about continuing on with the Aragon series because I didn't really like the second book, and so I never really read the third and fourth book, but I still love the first book even when I read it 1 year ago. So I would really recommend both of those. They're very quick and easy read, and both of them are great and I love them. Although if you choose one, choose this one. It's so much better. I always describe it like Aragon with a female protagonist, but just like worlds better. Next I have the Codex Alera series by Jim Butcher. This is also a high fantasy series, but it relies very heavily, especially on the military aspects of the Roman Empire, so you kind of know what to expect in some parts, and the political stuff isn't too hard to get into. I was really surprised how fast the plot picked up, with still a lot of world building, but very good and very easily accessible world building in this first book. And so I think this is a very easy and fast read for anyone who wants to start out with high fantasy. The next one is not really a beginner's book. I wouldn't say it's a gateway book to high fantasy, but I would definitely say that it's a gateway book into epic fantasy. So George R.R. Martin stuff, A Song of Ice and Fire, The Way of Kings. And there's the Hydron Chronicles by Jennifer Fallon, starting with Wolfblade. In a nutshell, this is Game of Thrones, just with a lot less characters and a lot less world building, but there's still a lot of world building if you're not used to fantasy. I still read this when I was pretty young. I think this was one of my 5 or 6 first high fantasy series that I read. I must have been about 12 or 13 as well. But as I said, I started quite early, so I was already an advanced high fantasy reader at that age. Again, this is not so much about magic, but more about political intrigue. There is some magic stuff in it, but it kind of takes a back seat, and I absolutely loved it. So if you're still very daunted by George R.R. Martin, I would recommend you first read this book. It doesn't look that much shorter than George R.R. Martin, but it's 700 instead of 1,000 pages, so just your typical high fantasy length. That was all my gateway books that I had for this week's Top 5 Wednesday. I really hope you found a book that intrigues you, that you might pick up maybe. I would highly recommend all of these books. They have all been some of my favorite high fantasy that I have ever read. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe. All the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so you can go and check those out and friend me or follow me. And I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!